I was staring at the family photo they just posted on social media. Everyone was there for my grandmother's 90th birthday, except me. They had literally cropped me out of the picture, but what they didn't know was that while they were busy erasing me from their narrative, I was building something they could never destroy, a legacy that would outlive their need to make me invisible. There I was, scrolling through Instagram at midnight, and suddenly my cousin's post appeared in my feed. The whole family gathered around my grandmother, smiling for the camera, celebrating her milestone birthday. Everyone looked so happy, so complete, so perfectly orchestrated. Except there was something wrong with the picture that made my stomach drop. I had been there. I remembered standing right next to my uncle, laughing at something my grandmother had said, feeling for a brief moment like maybe I finally belonged. I remembered the photographer taking multiple shots, making sure everyone was included. I remembered thinking that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. But in the photo they chose to share with the world, I was gone, edited out, erased, as if I had never been there at all. Before I tell you how I turned their rejection into my greatest strength, I need to know something. Comment below and tell me, have you ever been deliberately excluded or erased by people who were supposed to love you? Share your story, even if it's just one word. Your courage to acknowledge it is the first step to reclaiming your power. This wasn't the first time they had made me disappear. It was just the most obvious, the most digital, the most permanent proof of something I had felt my entire life, that in their eyes, I was the problem, the mistake, the one who didn't quite fit into their perfect family picture. Growing up, I was the one who asked too many questions, the one who pointed out inconsistencies in their stories, the one who refused to pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I was the one who called out the elephant in the room while everyone else tiptoed around it, smiling and making small talk as if nothing was wrong. They called me difficult, dramatic, too sensitive, the troublemaker, the black sheep, the one who always had to make things about myself, but what they really meant was that I was inconvenient. I was a mirror they didn't want to look into because I reflected back the parts of themselves and their family system that they weren't ready to acknowledge. In family gatherings, I was the afterthought, the one whose dietary restrictions weren't considered when planning meals, the one whose schedule wasn't checked before setting dates, the one whose achievements were mentioned briefly, and then the conversation quickly moved on to someone else's accomplishments that were deemed more worthy of celebration. I was the one who got the smaller bedroom when we stayed at relatives' houses, the one who was expected to give up my seat when there wasn't enough room at the table, the one whose feelings were dismissed with, "You're being too sensitive," whenever I tried to express hurt or disappointment about their treatment of me. But that cropped photo was different. It wasn't just passive exclusion anymore. It was active erasure. It was them taking a moment where I had actually been present, actually been part of the family, and deliberately removing me from the historical record. It was them saying that their version of the family looked better without me in it. And you know what? In that moment of staring at my own absence, something inside me shifted. Something that had been building for years finally crystallized into a clarity I had never experienced before. I realized that I had been fighting for a place at a table where I was never meant to sit. I had been begging for inclusion in a story where I was cast as the villain from the very beginning. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, looking at that edited photo, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to stop trying to fit into their picture and start creating my own frame. I decided to stop seeking their approval and start building something so meaningful that their opinion would become irrelevant. Maybe you know this feeling. Maybe you've been the one who was always criticized for being too much or not enough. Maybe you've been the one whose version of events was always questioned, whose motives were always suspect, whose presence was treated as a burden rather than a blessing. Maybe you've been the one who was blamed for family dysfunction, as if your very existence was the cause of problems that existed long before you were born. Maybe you've been the scapegoat, the one who carries the shame and secrets that everyone else is too afraid to face. If so, then you know the particular kind of pain that comes from being rejected by the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. You know what it feels like to watch everyone else receive grace while you're held to impossible standards. You know the exhaustion of constantly trying to prove your worth to people who seem determined not to see it. But here's what I learned that night, and what I want you to understand. Their inability to see your value isn't a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their limitations, their fears, their need to maintain a certain narrative that requires someone to be the problem so they don't have to examine their own issues. You see, every family system needs balance. Every family has shadows, secrets, dysfunctions that they don't want to acknowledge. And often, they unconsciously choose one member to carry all of that shadow for them. One person becomes the repository for everything they don't want to admit about themselves. The great psychologist Carl Jung understood this phenomenon deeply. He wrote about how groups, including families, will often project their collective shadow onto one individual. That person becomes the identified problem, the source of all dysfunction, the reason why the family can't be perfect. But in reality, that person is usually the one with enough courage to speak truth, enough sensitivity to feel the family's pain, enough strength to carry what others can't handle. If you've been that person in your family, if you've been the one they point to when they need someone to blame, then you've been carrying a burden that was never yours to carry. You've been serving a function that they needed you to serve. Not because you're actually the problem, but because they needed someone to be the problem so they could avoid looking at themselves. The cropped photo was just the latest in a lifetime of messages that said I was expendable, forgettable, easier to remove than to include. But instead of breaking me, it freed me. It gave me permission to stop pretending that their love was conditional because I wasn't good enough, and to start recognizing that their love was conditional because that's the only kind of love they knew how to give. That realization changed everything. It meant that the problem wasn't with me, it was with their capacity. It meant that I could stop trying to earn something they weren't capable of giving and start building a life based on what I was capable of creating. From that moment forward, I began to see my exclusion differently. Instead of seeing it as evidence of my unworthiness, I began to see it as evidence of my differentness. And differentness, I realized, could be a gift rather than a curse. The very qualities that made me difficult for them to handle, my questioning nature, my emotional honesty, my refusal to pretend everything was fine, these weren't flaws. These were superpowers that they couldn't appreciate because they threatened the false peace they were trying to maintain. I was too real for their pretend world, too authentic for their performance, too honest for their denial. And instead of seeing this as my failure, I began to see it as my calling. If you've been excluded, erased, or edited out of your family's story, I want you to consider the possibility that you weren't removed because you're too little. You were removed because you're too much, too perceptive, too authentic, too powerful for a system that requires everyone to stay small and quiet to function. Your exclusion isn't proof of your inadequacy, it's proof of your potency. And what I'm going to share with you is how to transform that exclusion from a source of pain into a source of power, from evidence of rejection into fuel for creating something so meaningful that their acceptance becomes irrelevant. Because the truth is, they didn't just crop you out of their photo, they cropped themselves out of your story. And your story, the one you're about to write with your own hands, is going to be so much more beautiful than anything they could have included you in. Understanding why families exclude certain members isn't just about personal hurt. It's about recognizing patterns that have been repeated for generations. When I began studying my own family dynamics through the lens of Carl Jung's work, I discovered that what happened to me wasn't personal, it was systemic. Every family, Jung understood, operates like a small psychological system with its own unconscious rules, unspoken agreements, and shadow material that nobody wants to acknowledge. In healthy families, this shadow material gets processed, discussed, and integrated. But in dysfunctional families, it gets projected onto one member who becomes the carrier of everything the family doesn't want to face about itself. I was that carrier, the scapegoat, the identified patient, the one who got blamed when things went wrong, even when I wasn't present, the one whose behavior was scrutinized while everyone else's was excused, the one who was expected to change so that the family could continue avoiding their own need for change. This dynamic has a name in psychology: triangulation. When there's tension between two people in a family system, instead of dealing with that tension directly, they unconsciously recruit a third person to absorb that tension. That third person becomes the problem, the focus of their anxiety, the reason why things aren't working. My parents had a marriage full of unresolved conflict, but instead of addressing their issues with each other, they focused on my behavior. I became the lightning rod for all their frustration, disappointment, and fear. When I acted out, they could unite in their concern about me. When I succeeded, they could worry together about whether I was becoming too prideful or independent. I was serving a function in their relationship, and that function required me to be the problem. If I got too healthy, too successful, too confident, it would upset the balance of their system. They needed me to struggle so they could feel needed. They needed me to be flawed so they could feel superior. They needed me to be the chaos so they could feel calm. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about family systems unconsciously assigning roles to different members. There's the golden child who can do no wrong. There's the lost child who stays invisible to avoid conflict. There's the mascot who uses humor to deflect tension. And there's the scapegoat who carries the family's shame and dysfunction. The scapegoat role is brutal because it's lonely and misunderstood, but it's also powerful because the person in this role usually has the clearest vision of what's really happening in the family. They're the ones who see through the pretense, who feel the undercurrents, who sense the secrets that everyone else is pretending don't exist. I was the one who noticed when my father came home smelling like alcohol, but nobody mentioned it. I was the one who felt the tension between my parents, even when they were putting on a happy face. I was the one who asked uncomfortable questions about family stories that didn't add up. And for this clarity, for this ability to see what others couldn't or wouldn't see, I was punished with exclusion. But here's what I didn't understand then. My ability to see clearly wasn't a flaw. It was a gift. The very sensitivity that made me inconvenient to my family was actually a form of emotional intelligence that would serve me powerfully in the world beyond their system. Jung wrote about this phenomenon as the wounded healer. The person who carries the family's pain often develops the greatest capacity for healing, both themselves and others. The one who is rejected often becomes the most empathetic. The one who is excluded often becomes the most inclusive. My exclusion from family photos was just the visible manifestation of an invisible pattern that had been operating my entire life. They had been editing me out of their narrative long before they started editing me out of their pictures. They had been treating me as optional, expendable, less important than their comfort and their image. But exclusion teaches you things that inclusion never could. It teaches you self-reliance. It teaches you to find validation from within rather than from others. It teaches you to create your own meaning rather than accepting the meaning others assign to you. It teaches you that your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. The psychology of exclusion is complex because it's both deeply wounding and potentially transformative. When we're excluded by people we love, it creates a crisis of identity. We start to question our own value, our own perceptions, our own right to exist in the spaces we're excluded from. But exclusion also creates fierce independence. It forces us to develop parts of ourselves that we might never have discovered if we had been easily accepted. It pushes us to prove our worth in ways that go far beyond what's required of people who are automatically included. I became driven in ways that my siblings, who were effortlessly accepted, never needed to become. I developed skills, pursued achievements, and built relationships outside the family that were deeper and more meaningful than anything they had within the family. I had to become exceptional because being ordinary wasn't enough to earn my place. The second major pattern I discovered in my family system was what Jung called projection. My family members had unconscious aspects of themselves that they couldn't acknowledge: anger, selfishness, neediness, imperfection, and they projected these qualities onto me. I became the angry one while they remained calm. I became the selfish one while they appeared generous. I became the needy one while they seemed independent. This projection served multiple functions for them. It allowed them to maintain their self-image as good, reasonable people by making me the unreasonable one. It gave them someone to blame when things went wrong. It created a common enemy that united them against me rather than having to deal with their conflicts with each other. But projection is never accurate. It's not really about the person receiving the projection. It's about the person doing the projecting. When my mother called me dramatic, she was avoiding her own dramatic tendencies. When my father called me irresponsible, he was deflecting from his own irresponsible choices. When they called me difficult, they were refusing to acknowledge their own difficulty. Understanding projection changed everything for me, because it meant that their criticisms weren't actually about me. They were about aspects of themselves that they couldn't face. I was just the convenient screen they projected their self-rejection onto. This realization was simultaneously liberating and infuriating. Liberating because it meant I could stop taking their criticisms personally. Infuriating because it meant I had spent years trying to fix things about myself that weren't actually problems. They were just reflections of their problems. The third pattern I recognized was what I call inherited exclusion. My father had been the scapegoat in his family of origin. He had been the one who was blamed, criticized, and excluded. Instead of healing from that experience and creating something different for his own children, he unconsciously recreated the same dynamic with me. He didn't do this because he was evil or because he didn't love me. He did it because it was the only family pattern he knew. Hurt people, not because they want to cause pain, but because they're unconsciously repeating the pain that was caused to them. This generational pattern of scapegoating gets passed down like a family heirloom that nobody wants but everybody inherits. The excluded child grows up and often becomes the excluding parent, not out of malice, but out of unhealed trauma that gets activated when they're in the parent role. Recognizing this pattern helped me understand that what happened to me wasn't personal, it was generational. I was caught in a cycle that had been repeating in my family for decades, maybe centuries. The same dynamic that had wounded my father was now wounding me, and if I didn't do something to break the cycle, it would wound my children too. But understanding the pattern also showed me something powerful. I had the ability to break the cycle. I could be the one who stopped the generational trauma from continuing. I could heal what had been wounded and create something different for the next generation. The psychology of invisibility that I experienced in my family taught me about another crucial concept from Jung's work: the shadow. Every family has a collective shadow, aspects of themselves that they don't want to acknowledge or accept. These might include anger, selfishness, weakness, failure, or any other human qualities that don't fit their idealized self-image. Instead of integrating their shadow, accepting that they're human beings with both light and dark aspects, many families project their shadow onto one member. That member becomes the carrier of everything the family rejects about itself. I carried my family's anger so they could see themselves as peaceful. I carried their chaos so they could see themselves as organized. I carried their dysfunction so they could see themselves as functional. I was their shadow made visible, and they hated me for showing them parts of themselves they didn't want to see. But Jung understood that the shadow isn't evil, it's just unconscious. It contains not only our rejected negative qualities, but also our rejected positive qualities. Often, the family scapegoat carries not just the family's dysfunction, but also their unexpressed power, creativity, and authenticity. I was carrying my family's capacity for truth-telling, for emotional honesty, for refusing to accept unacceptable situations. These weren't negative qualities. They were powerful qualities that threatened a system built on denial and pretense. When I began to reclaim these qualities as strengths rather than flaws, everything shifted. My ability to see through facades became valuable in my career. My refusal to accept less than I deserved led me to healthier relationships. My emotional honesty attracted people who valued authenticity over performance. The qualities that made me difficult for my family to handle made me invaluable to people who were looking for genuine connection and real solutions to real problems. What had been my curse in their system became my superpower in the larger world. This transformation from curse to superpower happens when we stop trying to fix ourselves, to fit into systems that are fundamentally broken, and start recognizing that our differentness might be exactly what the world needs. The family that couldn't handle my intensity gave me the intensity I needed to build something significant. The family that couldn't appreciate my sensitivity gave me the sensitivity I needed to help others who were suffering. The family that couldn't value my honesty gave me the honesty that would attract people who were hungry for truth. Their rejection wasn't a verdict on my worth, it was preparation for my work. Understanding these psychological patterns, scapegoating, projection, generational trauma, shadow projection, gave me a framework for making sense of my experience that went beyond personal hurt. It helped me see that what happened to me was part of larger systemic dynamics that affect millions of families. But more importantly, it showed me that I had choices. I could remain trapped in the role they had assigned me, or I could use my understanding of these patterns to break free and create something entirely different. The night I saw that cropped photo, I chose freedom. I chose to see my exclusion not as evidence of my inadequacy, but as evidence of my power. I chose to interpret their need to erase me as proof that my presence was so impactful they couldn't handle it. And I chose to stop waiting for them to edit me back into their story and start writing my own story instead. A story where I wasn't the problem to be solved, but the hero on a journey of transformation. The moment I recognized these patterns, I faced a choice that would define the rest of my life. I could continue playing the role they had assigned me, or I could refuse to carry their shadow any longer. I could keep trying to earn my way back into their good graces, or I could accept that their approval was never going to be available to someone like me, someone who threatened their need for denial and pretense. That choice led me to what Jung called the process of individuation, the psychological and spiritual journey of becoming who you truly are, separate from the roles and expectations that others have placed on you. For someone who has been the family's scapegoat, individuation isn't just personal growth, it's an act of rebellion against a system that requires your diminishment to function. The first step in breaking free from scapegoat patterns is refusing to accept the role of family problem any longer. This doesn't mean becoming defensive or trying to prove that you're not the problem. It means simply declining to participate in conversations, dynamics, or situations where you're expected to be the receptacle for everyone else's dysfunction. When my mother would call me to complain about other family members and then somehow make their problems my fault, I started saying, "That sounds frustrating for you, but I'm not responsible for their choices." When family gatherings devolved into criticism sessions focused on my life choices, I started leaving. When they tried to make me the spokesperson for family dysfunction in therapy sessions, I started refusing to attend. This boundary setting was terrifying at first because it meant risking even more rejection from people whose approval I had been desperately seeking my entire life. But what I discovered was that their rejection had already happened. I had been operating under the illusion that if I just tried harder, behaved better, achieved more, they would finally see my worth and include me fully. The cropped photo was the wake-up call that showed me they had never intended to include me fully. I had been auditioning for a role that was never going to be available to me. They needed me to be the problem more than they needed me to be successful, happy, or whole. Once I accepted this reality, I could stop exhausting myself trying to earn something that was never on the table and start investing that energy in building something that was entirely within my control. A life that reflected my values, my vision, and my definition of success. Jung wrote about this process as withdrawing projections. When we stop accepting other people's projections of us, we force them to deal with their own shadow material. When we refuse to be their dumping ground for everything they can't face about themselves, they have to either do their own inner work or find someone else to carry their burdens. Most of the time, they choose to find someone else. This is why breaking free from scapegoat patterns often means accepting that the relationships will change dramatically and not always for the better. Some family members will double down on trying to pull you back into the old role. Others will simply write you off as ungrateful or selfish. A few might actually do their own work and create the possibility for healthier relationships. But regardless of how they respond, your job is to stay committed to your own individuation process. Your job is to become so grounded in your own sense of self that their opinions, positive or negative, don't determine your sense of worth or direction. The second step in breaking free is learning to distinguish between family of origin and family of choice. Just because people share your DNA doesn't mean they're capable of the kind of love, support, and understanding that you need to thrive. Just because they gave you life doesn't mean they know how to nurture the life they gave you. Family of choice is about finding and creating relationships with people who see you clearly, appreciate your gifts, and support your growth, rather than requiring your diminishment. These might be friends who become like siblings, mentors who provide the guidance your parents couldn't give, or romantic partners who love you for exactly who you are, rather than who they need you to be. Building family of choice requires developing new criteria for relationships. Instead of accepting love that comes with conditions, criticism, and constant attempts to change you, you start seeking love that is accepting, encouraging, and supportive of your authentic self. This shift in relationship criteria was revolutionary for me. I had been so accustomed to relationships that required me to minimize myself that I didn't even recognize healthy love when it was offered to me. I had to learn to trust people who said positive things about me without adding a but at the end. I had to learn to receive affection that wasn't followed by expectations or demands. Most importantly, I had to learn to recognize that healthy people don't need you to be broken in order to feel good about themselves. Healthy people celebrate your successes, support your dreams, and encourage your growth because they understand that your flourishing doesn't threaten them, it inspires them. The relationships I built with my chosen family were fundamentally different from the relationships in my biological family. They were based on mutual respect rather than obligation. They were characterized by encouragement rather than criticism. They included conflict resolution rather than blame and punishment. These relationships taught me what love actually looks like when it's not filtered through dysfunction, trauma, and unhealed pain. They showed me that I wasn't too much, too sensitive, or too difficult. I had just been in relationships with people who needed me to be smaller than I am. The third step in breaking free is developing what I call sovereign self-worth. This means learning to validate yourself instead of seeking validation from others, especially from people who have already demonstrated their inability or unwillingness to see your value. Sovereign self-worth isn't arrogance or narcissism. It's the quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are, what you stand for, and what you're capable of, regardless of whether other people recognize these qualities in you. Developing this kind of self-worth required me to do something that felt radical. I had to become my own biggest supporter instead of my own biggest critic. I had to learn to speak to myself with the same kindness I would show a friend. I had to learn to celebrate my own achievements instead of minimizing them or waiting for others to acknowledge them. This internal shift changed everything about how I moved through the world. Instead of entering rooms wondering if I would be accepted, I started entering rooms confident in what I had to offer. Instead of apologizing for taking up space, I started claiming space unapologetically. Instead of shrinking myself to make others comfortable, I started expressing myself fully and letting others adjust to my presence. This transformation from people-pleasing to self-authorization was uncomfortable for everyone who had benefited from my previous willingness to be small, but it was liberating for me in ways I hadn't imagined possible. The fourth step is what Jung called shadow integration, reclaiming the parts of yourself that your family made you believe were wrong or bad. For scapegoats, this often means reclaiming your power, your voice, your standards, and your refusal to accept unacceptable treatment. My family had taught me that my anger was inappropriate, my boundaries were selfish, my standards were too high, and my expectations were unrealistic. But as I began to examine these messages more closely, I realized that what they were really saying was that my self-advocacy threatened their ability to take advantage of me. My anger wasn't inappropriate. It was a healthy response to being treated poorly. My boundaries weren't selfish. They were necessary protection for my well-being. My standards weren't too high. They were appropriate for someone who understood their own worth. My expectations weren't unrealistic. They were realistic for healthy relationships. Reclaiming these aspects of myself felt like putting on armor that I had been convinced I didn't deserve to wear. I started expressing anger when people mistreated me instead of turning that anger inward as self-criticism. I started setting boundaries without elaborate justifications or apologies. I started maintaining standards without feeling guilty for having them. This shadow integration process wasn't just about reclaiming rejected qualities. It was about becoming whole. It was about accepting all parts of myself, even the parts that made other people uncomfortable, and refusing to reject aspects of my personality just to make relationships easier for others. The fifth step is transforming your wound into wisdom. Jung understood that our deepest wounds often contain our greatest gifts. The very experiences that hurt us most can become the source of our ability to help others who are going through similar struggles. My experience as the family scapegoat gave me a deep understanding of exclusion, rejection, and the psychology of dysfunctional family systems. This understanding became the foundation for my ability to help other people who were struggling with similar dynamics. I started recognizing other scapegoats everywhere, in workplaces, friend groups, communities, and families. I could see the signs that others missed. The person who got blamed for problems they didn't create, the one whose perspective was always dismissed, the one who was expected to change so that everyone else could stay the same. And I started using my experience to offer them something I had desperately needed but never received: validation that their perceptions were accurate, confirmation that the treatment they were receiving wasn't normal or acceptable, and hope that they could create something different for themselves. This transformation from victim to healer didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without setbacks. There were times when I slipped back into old patterns of self-doubt, people-pleasing, and seeking approval from people who weren't capable of giving it. But each time I recognized these patterns and chose differently, I became stronger in my commitment to my own growth and healing. This transformation is hitting differently for many of you. I can see it in your comments. Take a moment right now and think, what's one thing you've always wanted to do but held back because you feared your family's judgment? Comment with just that one dream or goal. Your boldness to name it might inspire someone else to pursue theirs. The sixth step is creating meaning that transcends your family of origin's definition of success. Scapegoats often become high achievers because they're trying to prove their worth to people who have already decided they're worthless. But true liberation comes when you stop trying to prove anything to them and start building something that matters to you. For me, this meant shifting from external validation to internal satisfaction. Instead of pursuing achievements that would impress my family, I started pursuing work that felt meaningful to me. Instead of trying to become someone they would finally approve of, I started becoming someone I could be proud of. This shift led me to work that felt like a calling rather than just a career. It led me to relationships that felt like partnerships rather than performances. It led me to a lifestyle that reflected my values rather than their expectations. The beautiful irony is that when you stop trying to impress people who are determined not to be impressed, you often end up creating something so authentic and powerful that it attracts the recognition and respect you were seeking all along, just not from the people you originally wanted it from. The work I'm doing now, the relationships I've built, the impact I'm making, none of it would have been possible if I had stayed in the box my family tried to keep me in. Their rejection forced me to develop parts of myself that I never would have developed if I had been easily accepted. Their inability to see my potential pushed me to discover potential I didn't even know I had. Their refusal to validate my worth forced me to find worth that was independent of their opinion. Their exclusion from their limited vision of success pushed me to create a vision of success that was far more expansive and meaningful than anything they could have imagined for me. Breaking free from scapegoat patterns isn't just about personal healing. It's about generational healing. When you refuse to carry the family shadow any longer, you force the family system to evolve or dissolve. When you model healthy boundaries and authentic self-expression, you give other family members permission to do the same. Some of them will take that permission and begin their own journey of growth and healing. Others will resist the change and double down on the old patterns. But regardless of how they respond, you will have broken the cycle for yourself and for any children you might have in the future. You will have proven that it's possible to survive family rejection and create something beautiful from the ashes of that rejection. You will have demonstrated that being excluded from their story doesn't mean you can't write your own story. A story that might be far more interesting, meaningful and impactful than anything they could have included you in.